The Dog Who Adopted an Orphaned Kitten, A Story of Unconditional Love. Part 1. An Unlikely Meeting. It was a cold autumn morning, and the wind carried the scent of rain across the small suburban neighborhood. The sky was still heavy with clouds, and the trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering secrets to the ground. In a cozy little house at the edge of town, Max, a gentle golden retriever, stretched lazily on the front porch. He had lived a peaceful life with his owner, Mrs. Thompson, for years, a life filled with morning walks, afternoon naps, and the occasional chase after squirrels in the backyard. But today, something felt different. Today, his life was about to change in the most unexpected way. The cry in the wind. Max's ears twitched as he lay on the porch, his head resting on his paws. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then there it was again. A faint, desperate cry. He lifted his head, ears perking up. His tail wagged slightly as he listened, his heart instinctively drawn to the sound. It was high-pitched, soft, and filled with something Max couldn't quite understand. But he knew it was important. A plea for help. Max stood up, nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The sound was coming from the bushes near the fence, just beyond the garden. Without hesitation, he trotted toward it, a tiny ball of fur. Mrs. Thompson watched from the window, curious about what had caught Max's attention. She followed him outside, wrapping her sweater tightly around her as the wind picked up. By the time she reached the garden, Max was already standing by the bushes, his tail wagging slowly, his nose buried deep in the leaves. Then, he stepped back, and there, in the middle of the grass, was the tiniest kitten she had ever seen. It was no bigger than a handful, its fur damp from the morning dew, its tiny body trembling with fear and cold. Mrs. Thompson's heart ached at the sight. "Oh, you poor little thing," she whispered, kneeling down. The kitten looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, barely able to hold itself up. But before she could reach out, Max moved first, the first act of kindness. With the gentleness of a creature who understood fragile things, Max lowered his head and sniffed the kitten softly. The tiny creature flinched at first, its little body curling up in fear. But Max didn't move away. Instead, he lay down beside the kitten, his warm golden fur creating a barrier against the cold wind. He let out a small, reassuring huff, his presence radiating safety, not threat. And slowly, ever so slowly, the kitten stopped shaking. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mrs. Thompson watched in awe. She had seen Max be kind before, but this was something different, something deeper. And in that moment, she knew Max had already made up his mind. Bringing the kitten home, Mrs. Thompson carefully lifted the kitten into her hands. It was so light, its tiny heartbeat rapid beneath its fragile chest. Max stayed close, his nose never leaving the kitten's fur. "It's okay, buddy," Mrs. Thompson murmured. "We'll take care of it." Max wagged his tail, his eyes shining with understanding. Inside the house, Mrs. Thompson prepared a small, warm blanket and placed the kitten inside a shoebox near the fireplace. Max refused to leave its side. He lay down beside the box, his nose resting on the edge, watching the kitten with quiet patience. The kitten was still too weak to move much, but when Max let out a slow, comforting breath, the kitten made a tiny sound and pressed itself against his nose. It was the smallest gesture, but in that moment, something invisible yet unbreakable formed between them, the start of a new bond. That night, Max stayed close to the box. Mrs. Thompson had tried to move him to his bed, but he wouldn't budge. All right, she chuckled, shaking her head. "You win. Protect her." Max thumped his tail happily. The kitten, still weak, barely stirred, but every time it let out a tiny mew, Max was there, watching, waiting, protecting. And for the first time since it had been left alone in the world, the kitten wasn't alone anymore. Part 2. A bond begins to grow. The tiny kitten had survived the night, but it was still fragile, weak, and unsure of the world around it. Max, the gentle golden retriever, had already made up his mind. This kitten was now under his care. But would the kitten accept him? Could a scared, Abandoned creature learned to trust a protector unlike any it had known before. This was the beginning of a bond that would change both of their lives forever. The first challenge, feeding the kitten. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson carefully prepared a small bottle of warm kitten milk. She had raised orphaned kittens before, but this one was particularly tiny, probably no older than a week or two. As she knelt by the fireplace, where the kitten lay in a cozy shoebox lined with soft blankets, Max sat beside her, watching intently. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured as she lifted the kitten gently. "Let's get some food in you." The kitten whimpered softly, too weak to struggle, but it refused to drink at first. It turned its tiny head away, scared and unsure. Max whined softly, lowering his head to nuzzle the kitten gently. He wasn't pushing, he was encouraging, and it worked. The kitten opened its tiny mouth and began suckling on the bottle. Mrs. Thompson sighed in relief. Max wagged his tail, and for the first time, the kitten had a chance. The protector never leaves. For the next few days, Max never left the kitten's side. If the kitten let out the smallest cry, Max was there in an instant. If it shifted in its sleep, Max would nudge the blanket closer to keep it warm. If Mrs. Thompson fed the kitten, Max would sit close, his eyes full of quiet encouragement. The kitten, still wary of the world, didn't trust easily, but it didn't fear Max. Not anymore. One evening, as Max lay beside the shoebox, the kitten did something no one expected. It crawled out of the box, trembling on unsteady paws, and curled up against Max's fluffy tail. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth in awe. Max looked down at the tiny ball of fur resting against him, his tail wagging ever so gently. And just like that, the kitten had made its first choice. It had chosen Max. The first signs of trust. By the end of the first week, something magical had happened. The kitten, now named Willow, was no longer just surviving. It was starting to live. It began to nuzzle against Max's fur in the mornings. It playfully swiped at his tail when it twitched in his sleep. It even started following him around the house, wobbling on tiny paws like a shadow. Max, in turn, became not just a protector, but a teacher. He showed Willow how to chase small objects, nudging toys toward her with his nose. He let her climb onto his back, patiently walking around as she clung to his fur. He'd even licked her tiny face clean after each meal, just as a mother cat would. Willow had found a new family. And Max? Max had found something he never expected, someone who needed him just as much as he needed them. An unlikely family forms. One evening, as the sun set outside, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, Mrs. Thompson sat on the couch, watching them. Willow lay curled up between Max's front paws, her tiny body rising and falling with gentle breaths. Max rested his head beside her, his eyes half closed, his entire posture relaxed, peaceful, complete. "I never would have believed it," Mrs. Thompson whispered, smiling softly. A dog and a kitten, two creatures who should have been strangers, even enemies. And yet, they were family. A family that was just beginning to grow. Because love isn't limited by species. Love is limitless. And in that moment, as Max let out a content sigh and Willow snuggled closer, they both knew they had found home. Part 3. Exploring the world together. Willow, the tiny orphaned kitten, had gone from a scared, fragile creature to a curious little ball of energy. And at the center of her transformation was Max, the gentle golden retriever who had become her guardian, protector, and best friend. Their bond was unbreakable. But now, it was time for Willow to take her next big step, exploring the world beyond her cozy nest. And Max? He was more than ready to show her the way. The first steps outside. For weeks, Willow had stayed inside, safe and warm within the walls of Mrs. Thompson's home. But today, something exciting was about to happen. The back door opened, and a cool breeze drifted in. Sunlight poured through the doorway, casting a golden glow over the wooden floor. Max trotted toward the door, his tail wagging in anticipation. Willow, however, hesitated. She crouched low, her little nose twitching as she sniffed the fresh air. To her, the outside world was big, open, and unfamiliar. Max turned back and let out a gentle woof, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm here." That was all the encouragement Willow needed. With a tiny hop, she followed him outside for the first time in her life. A kitten's first taste of nature. The backyard was a whole new universe for Willow. The grass felt soft and cool under her tiny paws. Birds chirped above, making her ears flick curiously. The wind rustled the leaves, making her tail twitch with excitement. But as thrilling as it was also overwhelming. Willow stayed close to Max, walking carefully beneath his shadow. Every few steps, she would look up at him, as if making sure he was still there. And Max? He walked patiently beside her, his movements slow and reassuring. Whenever she paused, he paused. Whenever she got nervous, he gave her a gentle nudge with his nose. To Willow, Max wasn't just a guide. He was her safety, her anchor, her home. The first lesson in play. After a few minutes, Willow's nervousness began to fade. Her tiny paws became bolder, and soon, she wasn't just walking, she was exploring. Max watched with amusement as she swatted at a falling leaf, trying to catch it midair, pounced on a small twig, her instincts kicking in, stood on her hind legs to inspect a butterfly that fluttered just out of reach. Max, ever the patient teacher, decided it was time for her first lesson in play. He lowered himself into a play bow, his tail wagging. Willow stared at him, confused. Max let out a soft woof and nudged her gently. Then, with a gentle nudge of his paw, he rolled a small ball toward her. Willow jumped back at first, startled, but after a moment, her curiosity won. She poked the ball with her tiny paw, and when it rolled away, she chased after it. Max thumped his tail in approval. Willow had just learned her first game, and for the first time, she let out a soft, happy purr. The unexpected scare. Everything was going perfectly until the unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind sent a trash bin crashing over, making a loud bang. Willow froze, her tiny body stiff with fear, her ears flattened, and in the blink of an eye, she bolted. She ran toward the porch, her tiny heart racing, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. Max's instincts kicked in instantly. He sprinted after her, reaching the porch just as she curled into a tight ball beneath a wooden bench. She was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut. Max lowered himself beside her, blocking the wind with his body. Then, with infinite gentleness, he nudged her with his nose, letting out a reassuring huff. Willow didn't move at first, but then she opened her eyes. And when she saw Max's calm, steady gaze, she took a deep breath and relaxed. She wasn't alone. She never would be. The lesson of the day. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Thompson stepped outside and smiled at what she saw. Max lay curled up on the porch, and nestled between his front legs was Willow, sound asleep. The day had been a big one for the tiny kitten. She had faced a new world, a new experience, and a new fear. But in the end, she had learned something far more important. She had learned that whenever the world got too scary, Max would be there. And Max? He had learned something too. That protecting someone isn't just about keeping them safe. It's about giving them the confidence to face the world, knowing they're never alone. Part 4. The Mischievous Adventure. Willow had taken her first steps outside, faced her first fear, and discovered that no matter what happened, Max would always be there for her. But kittens are naturally curious, and now that Willow had gained some confidence, she was ready to explore more. What neither she nor Max knew was that her next adventure would be a little too daring and would prove just how deep their bond had truly become. A newfound confidence. By now, Willow no longer hesitated before following Max outside. Every morning, as soon as Mrs. Thompson opened the back door, Willow would dart out right behind Max, her tiny tail flicking with excitement. She had learned to chase butterflies, even if she never caught them, pounce on fallen leaves, though they always slipped away, climb onto Max's back and ride him like a tiny horse, which Max tolerated with endless patience. She was growing stronger, faster, and more playful, and Max was always watching over her, keeping her safe. But one afternoon, Willow decided she didn't want to stay in the yard anymore. She wanted to go further. She wanted to explore the world. And so, while Max was distracted sniffing around a bush, Willow slipped through a small gap in the fence and disappeared. The great escape. The moment Willow stepped into the neighbor's yard, everything felt different. The smells were new. The ground felt strange. The air even tasted different. She was thrilled. She dashed through flower beds, chasing imaginary prey. She climbed onto an old wooden barrel, balancing on wobbly paws. She jumped at a buzzing bee, only to realize that bees are not for playing. She was having the time of her life. But then, she heard a noise she didn't recognize. A low growl. Her tiny body froze. She turned her head slowly and saw a large, unfamiliar dog staring straight at her. The moment of danger. The dog was twice Max's size. A muscular Doberman with sharp eyes and an unfriendly stance. He belonged to the neighbor. And unlike Max, he wasn't particularly fond of small creatures. Willow's fur bristled. She crouched low, her tiny heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to run, but her paws wouldn't move. Then, the Doberman took a step forward. And then, bark. A loud, commanding bark shattered the silence. Willow's ears perked. She knew that bark. Max. And before she could even react, a golden blur burst through the fence, bounding toward her like a guardian angel. Max placed himself between Willow and the Doberman, standing tall, his tail raised, his body tense but controlled, his eyes locked onto the larger dog, his stance clear. This kitten is mine. You don't touch her. The rescue. For a tense moment, neither dog moved. The Doberman let out a short huff, clearly unimpressed. But Max didn't back down. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He just stood his ground, silent but firm. And after a few seconds, the Doberman turned and walked away. The danger was gone. Max immediately turned to Willow, sniffing her all over. She was shaken but unharmed. And then, before she even realized what she was doing, she pressed herself into his fur, burying her tiny face against him. She had never felt safer. Max let out a slow sigh of relief, licking the top of her head. "Come on." Mrs. Thompson's voice rang out from the other side of the fence. "Let's get you two home." The lesson learned. That night, as Willow curled up beside Max on his bed, she let out a soft purr. She had learned something very important today. She had learned that the world was big and exciting, but also dangerous. She had learned that not all dogs were as kind as Max. But most importantly, she had learned that no matter what happened, Max would always be there to protect her. And for the first time, she showed Max just how much he meant to her. She nuzzled her tiny face into his fur, kneading his side gently with her paws. Max's tail wagged softly as he rested his head beside her. In that moment, they weren't just dog and kitten. They were family. Part 5, A Forever Family. Willow had learned an important lesson. The world was big, exciting, but also dangerous. And Max? He had proven once again that he would always be there for her, no matter what. Their bond was no longer just that of a dog and a kitten. It was something deeper, something unbreakable, family. But their journey wasn't over yet, because soon, something beautiful would happen, something that would change both of their lives forever. The first time Willow called Max Mom, it started with a simple, innocent act. One morning, as Mrs. Thompson poured herself a cup of coffee, she noticed something unusual. Max lay stretched out on the floor, enjoying the warmth of the sun streaming through the window, and curled up beside him was Willow. But it wasn't just that she was curled up. It was what she was doing. She was kneading Max's belly with her tiny paws, her eyes half closed, purring softly. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched, because she recognized that behavior. It was something kittens did with their mothers. It was a sign of comfort, love, and trust. Willow wasn't just snuggling with Max. She was treating him like her mother. And the best part? Max didn't even flinch. He simply let her knead away, his tail wagging ever so slightly, as if he knew exactly what she was doing, as if he accepted his role completely, because in a way, he had become her mother. And in that moment, their bond was sealed forever. A heartwarming surprise. Days turned into weeks, and Willow grew stronger and bolder. She was no longer the tiny, scared kitten Max had found in the bushes. She was playful, mischievous, and full of life. But one thing never changed: her love for Max. Wherever he went, she followed. Whatever he did, she copied. And sometimes, she even tried to protect him back. One afternoon, Max was napping peacefully in the sun when Mrs. Thompson's friend came to visit. It was someone Max knew, someone he liked. But to Willow, this was a stranger. And strangers were not to be trusted. So, before Mrs. Thompson's friend could get too close, Willow jumped in front of Max, arched her tiny back, and hissed. Mrs. Thompson gasped. Her friend laughed. And Max? Max just opened one eye, let out a sigh, and nudged Willow gently with his nose as if to say, "It's okay, little one. I've got this." Willow blinked at him. Then, as if embarrassed, she slinked back to his side, curling up against him. Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "Well, Max," she said, "looks like she's protecting you now." And in that moment, something became clear. This wasn't just a story about a dog rescuing a kitten. It was a story about two souls who had saved each other. The forever home. Months passed, and soon, winter arrived. Willow had grown into a beautiful young cat, but her habits had never changed. She still slept curled up beside Max every night. She still followed him around like a little shadow, and she still treated him like the only family she had ever known. One evening, as the first snow began to fall outside, Mrs. Thompson sat on the couch, watching them. Max lay on the rug near the fireplace, and Willow was curled up right on top of him, her tiny body nestled into his fur. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over them. And as Mrs. Thompson took in the scene before her, she realized something. This wasn't just a friendship. It was love in its purest form. A love that transcended species, circumstances, and expectations. A love that had saved two hearts, one from loneliness and one from fear. A love that had turned a lost kitten and a gentle dog into something unbreakable. A family. And that family would last forever. Final thoughts: the power of unconditional love. Max and Willow's story is proof that family is not about blood, it's about love. Kindness has the power to change lives. Sometimes, the ones we save end up saving us. This was never just about a dog and a kitten. It was about love that knows no limits. And in a world that can sometimes feel cold and lonely, that is the kind of love we all need. True love knows no species. Max and Willow's story is a testament to the power of kindness, loyalty, and unconditional love. If you were touched by their journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible animal stories. Have you ever seen an unexpected animal friendship? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your heartwarming stories.